The records sat in the basement of the Chatham County Courthouse for 113 years before anyone thought to examine them closely. Tax assessments, birth registries, property transfers, the ordinary paperwork of a society built on human bondage. But buried in those yellowing ledgers was a pattern so disturbing that when Clark Thomas Hayes first noticed it in 1847, he stopped writing mid-sentence, his pen trembling above the page. 11 children, all documented as enslaved, all described with the same peculiar notation. Light complexion, European features, questionable origin. All had come from Thornhill Plantation. Hayes had been recording slave births and transfers for nearly 2 decades. He'd seen every variation the brutal arithmetic of slavery could produce, the children of mixed unions, the gradations of skin tone that determined a person's value at auction, the careful documentation that reduced human beings to livestock. But this was different. These children weren't listed as mulatto or quadroon, the terms slaveholders used to categorize those of mixed African and European ancestry. The descriptions were more specific, more troubling. Hair, straight, brown. Eyes, blue-gray. Skin, white, freckled. Features, entirely Caucasian in appearance. And every single entry traced back to the same place. A cotton plantation 15 miles south of Savannah, owned by the Marlowe family for 3 generations. Hayes closed the ledger and didn't speak of it to anyone. Some things he'd learned were safer left unexamined in Georgia in 1847. But he couldn't stop thinking about those children, couldn't stop wondering what was happening behind the gates of Thornhill Plantation that would produce such a consistent, impossible pattern. He wasn't the only one who'd noticed. Thomas Hayes had never intended to become a keeper of secrets. He'd taken the courthouse clerk position in 1829, fresh from a failed attempt at running a general store in Augusta. The work was tedious but steady, recording births, deaths, property transfers, tax assessments. In a county where human beings were bought and sold like cattle, most of the paperwork involved slavery in some form. Over the years, Hayes had developed a particular system for organizing records. He cross-referenced birth registries with property transfers, tracked family lineages, noted patterns in estate management. It was partly professional pride, partly a way to make sense of the overwhelming volume of documentation that passed through his hands. He'd created his own filing system, indexed by plantation name, that allowed him to trace the movement of enslaved people across Chatham County with unusual precision. It was this system that revealed the pattern. On a humid afternoon in July 1847, while reorganizing files damaged by a roof leak, Hayes pulled records for Thornhill Plantation to verify some tax documentation. As he laid out the birth registries chronologically, something caught his attention. The first entry was from 1831. Female child, born to Hannah, enslaved, light skin, unusual features, sold at 6 months old to a plantation in McIntosh County. Then 1833. Male child, born to Patience, enslaved, pale complexion, straight hair, blue eyes, sold at 8 months to an estate in Glynn County. 1835. Female child, born to Rebecca, enslaved, white skin, European features, sold at 1 year to a planter in Liberty County. The entries continued, spaced roughly 18 to 24 months apart, each describing children who seemed impossible given their mother's documented descriptions. And every child was sold within the first year of life, always to distant plantations, always with the notation from Thornhill Estate. Hayes spread 15 years of birth records across his desk, his hands shaking slightly as the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't the random occurrence of mixed-race children, which happened on many plantations. This was systematic, regular, deliberate. He thought about taking the records to his supervisor, then reconsidered. Judge Warren Pembroke owned 3 plantations himself and was known to socialize with Edmund Marlowe. Hayes thought about the sheriff, then remembered that Sheriff Dixon had purchased 2 young slaves from Thornhill just last year. Everyone was connected. Everyone had interests to protect. Hayes carefully returned the records to their proper places, but he kept his own private notation, a small ledger he maintained at home, where he documented what he'd found. He told himself he was just keeping accurate records, doing his job thoroughly. But late at night, Alone in his modest house on the edge of Savannah, he would open that ledger and stare at the entries, trying to reconcile what they implied with the world he lived in. 11 children documented clearly, but as he continued his research in the following weeks, being careful not to draw attention to his interest, he found references to 6 more, their documentation less clear, but following the same pattern. 17 children total sold from Thornhill Plantation between 1831 and 1847, and those were only the ones who'd survived to be sold. The burial records told another story. Rebecca Hartwell had spent 4 years working as a clerk for her uncle's auction house in Savannah. It was considered unseemly for a woman to be involved in such business, but her Uncle Edward was elderly and needed help with the records. His eyesight was failing, his hands trembled when he wrote, and the business required meticulous documentation to avoid legal disputes. Rebecca had a gift for numbers and an ability to remain composed even during the most disturbing sales. She'd taught herself to see past the human tragedy unfolding on the auction block, to focus only on the figures in her ledger. It was a survival mechanism, a way to do her job without being consumed by the horror of it. But in June of 1845, even her practiced detachment cracked. The auction house on Broughton Street was crowded that morning. Summer was the busy season for slave sales. Planters needed additional workers for harvest, and those who'd overextended financially during the previous year often sold people to cover debts. The air inside the building was stifling, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and something else Rebecca could never quite name. The scent of fear, perhaps, or desperation. She was recording bids in her ledger when the woman and child were brought to the platform. Rebecca had trained herself not to look too closely at the people being sold, to keep her eyes on her papers, her pen moving steadily across the page. But something about this pair made her glance up. The mother was perhaps 25, dark-skinned, with the muscular build of someone who'd spent years doing field work. She stood rigid on the platform, her face carefully blank, staring at some point beyond the crowd. It was a look Rebecca had seen countless times, the expression of someone who'd learned that showing emotion only made things worse. But it was the child who drew the attention of every person in that crowded room. The boy was perhaps 5 years old, small for his age, standing beside his mother with one hand clutching her worn skirt. He had pale skin, lighter than many of the planter's own children who played in Savannah's squares. His hair was auburn, straight, falling across a forehead dotted with freckles. His eyes were green, bright and terrified, darting around the room as if seeking escape. If Rebecca had seen him on the street, she would have assumed he was the son of a shopkeeper or a farmer, perhaps Irish or Scottish in origin. She certainly wouldn't have guessed he was enslaved. The room went silent. The auctioneer, a man named Brennan, who'd conducted hundreds of these sales, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. He shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, adjusted his spectacles. From Thornhill Plantation, he finally announced, his voice lacking its usual confidence. The mother, Esther, aged approximately 25, strong, healthy, experienced in fieldwork and domestic service. The child, name recorded as Thomas, aged 5 years, sound of body, good temperament, both for sale as a lot, or separately if preferred. Starting bid, wait. The interruption came from the back of the room. A planter Rebecca didn't recognize, tall and weathered, with the suspicious expression of a man who'd been cheated before. Where's his father? The auctioneer shuffled his papers again. Not listed in the documentation, sir, as is common in such cases. Common? The planter's voice rose. Look at that child, Brennan. Look at his mother. You telling me that's a natural combination? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several planters moved closer to the platform, examining the pair with the clinical detachment they'd use when inspecting livestock. The boy pressed closer to his mother, his green eyes wide with fear. The documentation is complete and legal, gentlemen, Brennan said, his voice firm now, taking control of the situation. The child was born enslaved, properly registered with Chatham County. The mother's ownership is undisputed. Both are legal property of Thornhill Plantation, consigned here for sale by Mr. Edmund Marlowe. I have all the papers in order. But who's the father? Another voice called out. That boy looks white as chalk. Someone here knows something about Thornhill Plantation we don't? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Rebecca watched her Uncle Edward shift uncomfortably beside the platform. She saw Brennan's jaw tighten, saw his hand grip his gavel a bit too firmly. The father's identity is not germane to the sale, Brennan declared. Under Georgia law, the status of a child follows the condition of the mother. Esther is enslaved, therefore her child is enslaved, regardless of paternity. That is the law, gentlemen. Now, shall we proceed with the bidding? The planter at the back of the room shook his head in disgust and walked out. Several others followed. Those who remained bid cautiously, as if uncertain what they were purchasing, as if the child's appearance made them somehow complicit in something they didn't want to acknowledge. The pair eventually sold for less than the auctioneer had expected. $400 for both, purchased by a farmer from Burke County who needed field hands and seemed less troubled by the boy's appearance than others. Or perhaps he saw an opportunity, Rebecca thought darkly. A child who looked like that could be employed in ways that darker-skinned enslaved people couldn't. After the sale concluded, after the crowd had dispersed and the farmer had left with his new property, Rebecca approached her uncle. He was sitting in his office, drinking whiskey even though it was barely noon, staring at nothing. "Uncle Edward," she said quietly, "that child, how is it possible?" Her uncle looked at her with tired, bloodshot eyes. "You're a clever girl, Rebecca. I think you can imagine how it's possible. But surely," she struggled for words, "surely that's illegal. Surely there's some law." "There's no law," Edward interrupted. "Oh, there are laws about assault, about violence. But between a master and his property?" He laughed bitterly. "The law sees no crime there. The law says he can do whatever he wishes with his property, and any children born are simply more property. It's perfectly legal, Rebecca. That's the horror of it." Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. Has this happened before? Children like that from Thornhill? Edward took another drink. "This is the 4th time in the 3 years you've been working here. There were others before that, when I was running the business alone. Always from Thornhill, always the same story. White-looking children sold with no mention of the father, documentation all in order, everything legal and proper." 4 times, Rebecca whispered. "That I've seen personally. Could be more that went through other auction houses in Savannah. Could be some that were sold privately, never came to public auction at all. The Marlowes are always careful to separate the children from their mothers after a few years, send them to different sales, different counties. Makes it harder to track a pattern." "Why would they do that?" Her uncle's expression darkened. "Because someone at Thornhill doesn't want anyone asking questions. Because if all these children appeared together, if people saw them all at once, even in Georgia someone might be bothered enough to make trouble. Spread them out, sell them young before they can talk, send them far away. The pattern disappears. Each child becomes an isolated case, an affair maybe, something people shrug off and forget." Rebecca thought about the boy, about his terrified green eyes, about how he'd clung to his mother as they were led away. What will happen to him? The same thing that happens to all enslaved children. He'll work. He'll grow up not knowing his father, not knowing the full truth of where he came from. Maybe he'll survive to see freedom someday, maybe not. But he'll never have a normal life, Rebecca. How could he? Born into slavery, looking like that, with a history that no one wants to examine too closely. Uncle Edward finished his whiskey and poured another glass. "I've been in this business 30 years. I've seen every kind of cruelty, every kind of injustice. But what's happening at Thornhill Plantation is something different. It's systematic, it's deliberate, and everyone with power knows about it and does nothing because the law is on the master's side." Rebecca returned to her desk and opened her own private ledger, separate from the official records. She made a careful entry. June 1845. Mother, Esther. Child, Thomas, aged 5, pale skin, green eyes, auburn hair. From Thornhill Plantation. Sold to Burke County. 4th such case. She underlined 4th twice. Then she closed the ledger and locked it in her desk drawer, next to the small pistol her uncle insisted she keep for protection. Protection from what? She'd always wondered. Now she was beginning to understand that some threats were far too large and institutional for a pistol to defend against. Thornhill Plantation sprawled across 1,800 acres of Georgia lowland, bordered by the Ogeechee River on one side and thick pine forest on the other. The main house was a columned monument to wealth built on cotton and human suffering. White-painted, imposing, 3 stories tall with wraparound porches and large windows that caught the breeze on humid summer evenings. The architect had been imported from Charleston in 1805 to design it for Edmund Marlowe's grandfather. The columns were cypress, each one hand-carved by enslaved craftsmen whose names were never recorded. The interior featured imported Italian marble, crystal chandeliers shipped from Boston, furniture crafted by artisans in Philadelphia. The library held over 2,000 volumes. The dining room could seat 30 guests comfortably. It was, by all accounts, one of the finest homes in Chatham County. Behind the main house, stretching toward the river, were the formal gardens. Rose bushes, magnolia trees, carefully maintained paths lined with boxwood hedges, a fountain imported from France. A gazebo where ladies could sit in the shade and enjoy the view while enslaved workers brought refreshments. And beyond the gardens, invisible from the main house, invisible from the road, were the quarters where 247 enslaved people lived in conditions that would have shamed any civilized society. Long wooden buildings, each one housing 20 to 30 people in cramped, airless rooms. Dirt floors, no windows, walls that let in rain and cold. A single well for drinking water, outdoor facilities that bred disease, children sleeping on the ground, families separated by walls so thin you could hear everything happening in the next room. This was where the wealth came from, the labor that planted, tended, picked, and processed cotton. The women who cooked, cleaned, sewed, and washed. The craftsmen who maintained buildings, equipment, and infrastructure. The domestic workers who kept the main house running like a luxury hotel. All of it documented in meticulous ledgers that reduced human beings to inventory items, valued according to age, skill, health, and reproductive capacity. But there was one building that didn't quite fit the pattern. Set apart from both the main house and the quarters, hidden by a screen of live oak trees draped with Spanish moss, stood a smaller structure. A cottage, really, built in 1798 by Edmund Marlowe's grandfather. It had its own well, its own vegetable garden, its own fence. The windows had shutters that could be locked from the outside. The door had a heavy bolt. Locally, among those who knew about it, it was called different things. The breeding house was most common, though never in polite company. Some of the enslaved workers called it the prison. Others called it the devil's house. Edmund Marlowe, in his private papers, referred to it as the special quarters. The cottage was approximately 30 feet by 20 feet, divided into 4 small rooms. Each room had a narrow bed, a chamber pot, a small table, and nothing else. No decoration, no comfort, no privacy. The windows were barred, the doors locked from the outside. At any given time, between 1798 and 1848, anywhere from 2 to 6 women were kept in that cottage, isolated from the rest of the plantation's population. They were selected according to specific criteria, young, between 15 and 25 years old. Healthy, no physical defects, no history of difficulty or resistance. Strong build, good teeth, clear eyes. The selection process was careful, deliberate, documented. Once selected, a woman would be moved from the general quarters to the cottage. She would be fed better than the field workers. More meat, fresh vegetables from the cottage garden, milk occasionally. She would be given lighter work, usually spinning or sewing, tasks that could be done while confined. She would be examined regularly by whoever served as plantation physician, ensuring she remained healthy. And Edmund Marlowe would visit, regularly, predictably. When a woman became pregnant, the visits would stop. She would be monitored throughout the pregnancy, given even better food, excused from all work in the final months. When she gave birth, if the child survived, it would be taken from her within days, sometimes hours. If the child had dark skin, typical features, it might be left with the mother, and both returned to the general population. But if the child had pale skin, light hair, European features, the child would be taken to the main house. It would be fed by a wet nurse, cared for by domestic workers, kept separate from its mother, and within 6 to 18 months it would be sold. Always to distant plantations, always with careful documentation showing legitimate ownership and legal transfer. The mother would recover from childbirth in the cottage, then be returned to the general population if she'd served her purpose, or kept in the cottage if she was young enough to produce more children. This system had been in place for 50 years by 1847. 50 years of selecting women, 50 years of forced pregnancies, 50 years of taking children and selling them like livestock. 50 years of carefully maintained documentation showing that everything was legal, proper, and within the rights of a plantation owner managing his property. Daniel Prescott arrived at Thornhill Plantation in April of 1842, hired as overseer at the generous salary of $800 per year, plus housing and provisions. At 32 years old, with 7 years of experience managing agricultural operations in North Carolina, he considered it an excellent opportunity. The position had become available suddenly. The previous overseer, a man named Cullen, had left without notice in February. Edmund Marlowe had written to several plantation management services seeking a replacement, and Prescott's name had been recommended. The work seemed straightforward: manage the cotton operation, supervise the enslaved workforce, maintain productivity, keep detailed records. Marlowe was known as an exacting but fair employer. The plantation was profitable and well established. Prescott looked forward to demonstrating his capabilities and perhaps eventually managing his own estate. He lasted 7 months. For the first 3 weeks, everything proceeded normally. Prescott learned the plantation's routines, met the key workers, reviewed the account books, and familiarized himself with Marlowe's expectations. The cotton operation was efficient, the workforce disciplined, the records immaculate. Then, in early May, Edmund Marlowe called him to the main house for a private conversation. "Mr. Prescott," Marlowe began, sitting behind an enormous mahogany desk in his study, "you've been doing excellent work. I'm pleased with your management style. But there's an additional aspect of your responsibilities that we need to discuss." "Sir?" Marlowe opened a drawer and withdrew a ledger, placing it on the desk between them. "This plantation has certain special operations that require discretion. I need to know that I can trust you to maintain that discretion absolutely." Prescott felt a flutter of unease, but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Marlowe. I understand that plantation business often involves sensitive matters." "Indeed." Marlowe opened the ledger, revealing columns of entries written in precise handwriting. "You're aware of the cottage beyond the gardens? The separate building with the fenced yard?" "I've seen it, sir. I assumed it was storage or perhaps quarters for domestic staff." "It serves a different purpose." Marlowe's voice was calm, businesslike. "I maintain a selective breeding program on this estate, Mr. Prescott. I identify females with desirable traits, health, strength, good constitution, and I keep them in controlled conditions to produce offspring of the highest quality." The way he said breeding program, the clinical detachment in his voice, made Prescott's stomach turn. But he kept his expression neutral. Many plantations practiced selective breeding, encouraging matches between healthy workers to produce strong children. It was distasteful, but common. "The children produced through this program," Marlowe continued, "often have unusual features, light skin, European characteristics. These children command premium prices at auction when properly marketed. They're particularly valuable for domestic service." Prescott stared at him. "Sir, are you saying—" "I'm saying that part of your duties as overseer includes managing this aspect of the plantation's operations. You'll ensure that the women in the cottage are properly fed and cared for. You'll coordinate with the midwife when births occur. You'll arrange for the children to be transported to Savannah for sale when the time is appropriate. And you'll maintain absolute discretion about all of it." The room seemed to tilt. Prescott gripped the arms of his chair. "Mr. Marlowe, with respect, what you're describing sounds like good business." Marlowe interrupted sharply. "Let me be very clear, Mr. Prescott. What happens in that cottage is entirely legal. Any child born to an enslaved mother is enslaved, regardless of paternity. That is Georgia law. I am breaking no statutes. I am simply maximizing the productivity of my property. But the women are property. They have no legal standing to refuse anything I require of them. They are not harmed, Mr. Prescott. They are fed well, housed better than the field workers, given light duties. Many would consider it a privilege. Prescott felt bile rising in his throat. Sir, I cannot. You can and you will if you wish to remain employed here. Marlowe's voice went cold. Mr. Prescott, you signed a contract. You accepted this position. I've paid you a month's wages already. If you choose to leave, I'll expect repayment of those wages plus damages for breach of contract. I have excellent lawyers, and you'll find no work in Georgia after I explain to other plantation owners that you couldn't handle the basic responsibilities of an overseer position. The threat was clear. Prescott was not a wealthy man. He had $50 saved, not nearly enough to repay wages and fight a legal battle. And Marlowe was right. A reputation for being difficult or unreliable would destroy his career. You'll start tomorrow, Marlowe said, closing the ledger. The cottage currently houses 4 women. 2 are pregnant and will give birth within the next few months. You'll ensure the midwife attends both births and reports to me immediately on the children's appearance. Understood. Prescott managed to nod. Good. One more thing, Mr. Prescott. You are never to speak about this to anyone outside this plantation. Not to friends, not to family, not to other overseers. What happens at Thornhill stays at Thornhill. If I discover you've violated this confidence, I will destroy you financially and legally. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir. For the next 7 months, Daniel Prescott performed his duties with mechanical precision, trying not to think about what he was complicit in. He arranged for meals to be delivered to the cottage. He coordinated with the midwife. He documented births. He arranged for children to be transported to auction houses. And every night he lay awake in his overseer's house, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile his actions with his conscience. In November of 1842, a woman named Grace gave birth in the cottage. The child was a boy, pale-skinned with blonde hair. When Prescott delivered the baby to the main house, Marlowe examined it with the same clinical detachment he'd use when inspecting a calf. Excellent specimen, Marlowe declared. This one will fetch at least $400. Make arrangements to transport him to Savannah in 6 months. Use the auction house on Broughton Street, not the one on Bay Street. And ensure the mother doesn't see him again. It makes the separation easier if there's no continued attachment. Prescott stared at the infant, at its tiny hands and blue eyes, at the way it made small mewling sounds. This wasn't a calf or a puppy. This was a human child, and he was being asked to participate in tearing it from its mother and selling it like livestock. That night, Daniel Prescott made his decision. He left Thornhill Plantation at dawn the next morning, taking only what he could carry in a single bag. He abandoned a month's wages, forfeited his contract, and rode north toward North Carolina without looking back. Marlowe sent lawyers after him, but Prescott had crossed state lines and hidden himself among family in the mountains where Georgia lawyers had no jurisdiction. The legal threats eventually stopped. Marlowe hired a new overseer, a man less troubled by moral qualms. And Prescott never spoke about what he'd seen, not in any specific way, because who would believe him? And even if they believed him, what could be done? It was all legal. Every bit of it protected by laws designed to ensure that property owners faced no accountability for how they managed their property. When his younger brother finally pressed him years later about why he'd left such a lucrative position, Prescott had gone pale and said only, "There are things happening there that no Christian man should witness. Things I won't describe because no one would believe me. And if they did believe me, nothing would change. The law is on his side." He died in 1844. 2 years after leaving Thornhill, taking the specific details of what he'd witnessed to his grave. Dr. Marcus Fielding arrived in Chatham County in late 1846, setting up practice in Savannah after completing his medical training in Philadelphia. He was 31, idealistic, and entirely unprepared for the realities of practicing medicine in a slave state. His mentor in Philadelphia, Dr. Benjamin Rush's nephew, had warned him, "You'll find that medicine in the South operates under different principles than here, Marcus. You'll be called to treat enslaved people, and you'll discover that your role isn't primarily as a healer, but as a property maintenance specialist. It will challenge everything you learned about medical ethics." Fielding had nodded, thinking he understood. He didn't. His first call to treat an enslaved patient came 3 days after he'd hung his shingle on Bull Street. A planter named Augustus Webb needed a physician to examine a woman who'd been injured during fieldwork. Fielding arrived at the Webb plantation with his medical bag, expecting to treat a patient like any other. Instead, he found a woman named Dinah lying on the floor of a cabin, her leg clearly broken, in obvious pain, with no treatment beyond a dirty bandage. She'd been injured 2 days earlier, and Webb had waited to call a physician because, as he explained, "I wanted to see if it would heal on its own. No sense paying for medical treatment if it's not necessary." Fielding was horrified. "Mr. Webb, this woman has been in agony for 2 days. The bone has started to set incorrectly. I'll need to re-break it and set it properly, which will be extremely painful. Why wasn't she treated immediately?" Webb looked at him as if he'd asked a stupid question. "She's a slave, doctor. I don't call physicians for minor injuries. But the leg isn't healing right, and she's worth about $800. Can't have her crippled, so fix her. Fix her." As if she were a piece of broken furniture. Fielding did his best, treating Dinah with as much care and pain management as he could provide under the circumstances. But the experience shook him deeply. This was what plantation medicine meant, treating human beings as livestock, their value measured only in dollars, their suffering irrelevant except as it affected their work capacity. Over the following months, Dr. Fielding was called to various plantations for various cases. A man with a festering wound who'd been working for a week before anyone thought to seek treatment. A woman hemorrhaging after childbirth, the midwife unable to stop the bleeding, Fielding arriving too late to save her. Children with diseases that could have been easily treated if caught early, but which had advanced to dangerous stages because their owners didn't want to pay for medical care. Each case reinforced the same brutal lesson. Enslaved people's lives mattered only insofar as they represented financial investment. It was during a call to the Beaumont Plantation in March of 1847 that Fielding first encountered what he would later think of as the Thornhill Children. The Beaumont estate was about 20 miles from Savannah, a mid-sized operation with approximately 90 enslaved workers. Fielding had been called to treat several cases of respiratory infection that were spreading through the quarters. He spent the morning examining patients, dispensing medicine, providing instructions for care. As he was preparing to leave, Mrs. Beaumont approached him. "Doctor, there's one more patient I'd like you to examine. A child, Sarah. She's been coughing for several days, and I'm concerned it might develop into something serious." Of course, Mrs. Beaumont. She led him to a cabin where a young girl, perhaps 9 years old, lay on a narrow bed. The moment Fielding saw her, he stopped short. The child had pale skin, almost translucent. Her hair was blonde, fine and straight, spread across a thin pillow. Her eyes, when she looked up at him, were deep blue. She looked like she could be German or Scandinavian, perhaps the daughter of recent immigrants from Northern Europe. She absolutely did not look like she should be enslaved in Georgia. Fielding examined her carefully, noting signs of bronchitis, likely treatable with rest and proper care. As he worked, he couldn't stop staring at her appearance, trying to make sense of it. "Mrs. Beaumont," he finally said, keeping his voice casual. "This child, Sarah, where is her family?" "Her mother died in childbirth. Never knew her father. We purchased the mother from an estate sale about 10 years ago. Didn't realize she was pregnant until after we'd bought her. When Sarah was born looking like that," Mrs. Beaumont trailed off, uncomfortable. "Looking like what?" "Well, white, doctor. Clear as day. We were all shocked. But the documentation was legitimate. The mother was enslaved, so Sarah is enslaved, regardless of who her father might have been. And the mother came from Thornhill Plantation, I believe." The sale was managed by Edmund Marlowe's agent. My husband got a good price because of what the child might look like. Marlowe was apparently eager to sell the mother before the child was born, wanted to avoid any awkwardness. Fielding felt his stomach tighten. Has your husband seen other cases like this? Children with Sarah's appearance? Mrs. Beaumont looked uncomfortable. I really shouldn't speculate, Doctor. These matters are delicate. All I know is that Thornhill Plantation seems to produce more than its share of light-skinned children, and Mr. Marlowe prefers to sell them quietly to distant estates. My husband purchased Sarah's mother because the price was excellent, and we needed domestic workers. We've tried to treat Sarah well. She works in the house, not the fields, as if that somehow made the situation acceptable. Fielding treated Sarah's respiratory infection and left instructions for her care, but he couldn't stop thinking about her, about the implications of what Mrs. Beaumont had said so casually. Thornhill Plantation seems to produce more than its share of light-skinned children. Over the following months, Dr. Fielding encountered 3 more children with similar features, all with documented connections to Thornhill Plantation. A 7-year-old boy named Jacob on the Carson estate, with red hair and green eyes, born to a woman who'd been sold from Thornhill while pregnant. Twin girls, age 4, with blonde curls and fair complexions, recently purchased by a merchant in Savannah as domestic servants, their mother having died at Thornhill shortly after their birth. And a 10-year-old girl named Louisa, working as a house servant for a judge in Savannah, her pale skin and grey eyes marking her as different from every other enslaved person in the household. Each time, when Fielding inquired discreetly about their origins, the answer was the same: Thornhill Plantation. He began keeping private notes, documenting each case in a journal he kept locked in his office. He noted physical descriptions, ages, documented origins, current locations. He started seeing a pattern that was impossible to ignore. One evening in September of 1847, after treating a fever outbreak at a plantation near the Ogeechee River, Fielding accepted an invitation to dine with the owner, Colonel Peter Saunders. The colonel was in his 60s, a veteran of the War of 1812, a respected member of Savannah society. After several glasses of port, he became talkative. "You're new to Georgia, Dr. Fielding," the colonel said, settling into a leather chair in his study. "Still have that northern sensibility about you. I can see it in how you treat the slaves, like they're people rather than property." Fielding kept his expression neutral. "I treat them as patients, Colonel." "Yes, well," Saunders swirled his glass thoughtfully. "You'll learn that different plantations have different philosophies, different approaches to maximizing profit from their investments. Some owners believe in, let's say, exploiting all potential sources of revenue. I'm not sure I follow." The colonel leaned forward, lowering his voice even though they were alone. "You've seen those pale children coming out of Thornhill, haven't you? Everyone in the county has heard about them. Been going on for decades, since Edmund Marlowe's father ran the place. Maybe even his grandfather, though records from back then are spotty. What exactly are you suggesting, Colonel?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts that any informed person in Chatham County could confirm. The Marlowe men have always kept that separate house on their property, always kept certain female slaves isolated there, away from the general population. They're very particular about who goes near that cottage, very particular about the women they select. Young, healthy, attractive by any standard. Attractive. And every few years, another light-skinned child appears on the auction block, sold off quietly to distant plantations where no one will notice the pattern." Fielding felt his hands clench around his own glass. That's unconscionable." "It's legal," Saunders corrected coldly. "Completely, absolutely legal. Any child born to an enslaved mother is enslaved, regardless of the father's identity. That's the law, Dr. Fielding. Has been since Virginia passed the partus sequitur ventrum principle in 1662. Mother's status determines child's status. The Marlowes aren't breaking any statutes. They're simply maximizing their assets. Surely there must be some recourse." "For whom?" Saunders interrupted. "The children are slaves, born to enslaved mothers, properly documented, legally sold. The mothers won't testify, and they can't by law. Slaves cannot testify against white people in Georgia courts. They have no legal standing, no rights, no voice. The fathers? He laughed bitterly. The fathers are the owners, Doctor. You think Edmund Marlowe will confess? You think any court will compel a white landowner to answer questions about his private conduct on his own property with his own property? But surely the morality? Saunders drained his glass. Dr. Fielding, you're in Georgia. The entire economic system here is built on treating human beings as property. Once you accept that fundamental principle, once you say that one person can own another person absolutely, everything else becomes logical. If a man owns a woman as property, then he owns her completely. Her body, her labor, her children, all of it. The law protects his property rights absolutely. There's no moral question in the eyes of the law, because property has no rights. The logic was airtight, the system perfectly designed to protect the powerful and ensure that the vulnerable had no recourse whatsoever. My advice, Saunders continued, refilling his glass, is to focus on your medical practice and avoid asking questions about Thornhill Plantation. Edmund Marlowe is a powerful man, Doctor. He sits on the county council. He's a major donor to the Baptist Church. He has connections in Savannah society that go back 3 generations. He doesn't take kindly to curiosity about his private affairs, and he has the means to make life very difficult for anyone who troubles him. Is that a threat, Colonel? It's advice. Friendly advice from someone who's lived in Georgia longer than you've been alive. There are battles worth fighting, Doctor, and battles that will destroy you for no gain. Asking questions about Edmund Marlowe's breeding operations falls into the latter category. Fielding left the Colonel's house that night, feeling deeply disturbed. The casual way Saunders had discussed it, breeding operations, as if they were talking about livestock management rather than human lives. The certainty that no legal recourse existed, that the system was designed specifically to permit this kind of exploitation. But Dr. Fielding couldn't let it go. Over the next year, he began keeping more detailed records, documenting every child he encountered who matched the pattern. He noted their physical descriptions, their ages, their documented origins. He asked careful questions of other physicians, of auctioneers, of anyone who might have information without being so direct that he drew unwanted attention. He contacted the county courthouse, claiming he was conducting medical research on genetic inheritance and requested access to birth records. Clerk Thomas Hayes, nervous but sympathetic to Fielding's careful inquiries, allowed him access to certain documents while keeping the nature of his research private. Together, working carefully, they documented a pattern that was undeniable. Between 1830 and 1848, at least 21 children matching this description had been born at Thornhill Plantation. 21 children with European features, born to enslaved women with African features, all sold within their first year of life to distant plantations across Georgia and neighboring states, and these were only the ones they could verify through existing records. How many others had been sold before documentation practices were standardized? How many had died young, their births and deaths recorded only in the vaguest terms? How many had been sold through private transactions that left no paper trail? The true number could be 50, could be 100, spanning 3 generations of the Marlowe family, going back to the late 1700s. Dr. Fielding kept his research locked in a trunk in his office under his medical supplies, where no casual search would find it. He continued his practice, treating patients, building his reputation. But late at night, he would review his documentation, adding new cases as he discovered them, building a record of systematic abuse that spanned decades. And he waited for an opportunity to make it public, to force someone with power to acknowledge what was happening at Thornhill Plantation. That opportunity would not come for years, but Fielding was patient, methodical, determined. He believed that truth, once properly documented, would eventually demand justice. He had no idea how wrong he was. In March of 1848, a woman named Ruth was sent to Dr. Fielding's office by her current owner, a merchant named Tobias Wright, who'd purchased her 6 months earlier at a private sale. She was suffering from persistent fever and respiratory problems that weren't responding to home remedies. Fielding examined her in the small back room he used for treating enslaved patients, separate from the main office where he saw white clients. The physical separation was legally required and socially expected. Another reminder of the rigid caste system that governed every aspect of Southern life. Ruth was perhaps 25, thin to the point of malnutrition, with deep scars on her wrists that looked like shackle marks. Her breathing was labored, her fever significant. But more striking was her emotional state. She was clearly terrified, flinching at sudden movements, her eyes darting constantly toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in. As Fielding examined her, checking her lungs and assessing her condition, she suddenly grasped his arm with surprising strength. "Doctor," she whispered urgently, "I need to tell someone what happened. Before I die, before they move me again, someone needs to know." "You're not going to die, Ruth," Fielding said gently, though in truth her condition was serious. "The fever is concerning, but with proper treatment and rest, not from the fever." Her grip on his arm tightened. "From what they'll do to me when they find out I talked. Mr. Wright doesn't know my history. He bought me thinking I was just another house servant. But if Mr. Marlowe finds out I'm in Savannah, that I'm talking to people—" Fielding felt his pulse quicken. "Marlowe? Edmund Marlowe. You were at Thornhill Plantation?" Ruth nodded, tears starting to stream down her face. 6 years. I was there for 6 years, from when I was 17 until last year. He selected me from the fields, said I had good features, strong build. Took me to that cottage behind the main house and locked me in. Fielding carefully set down his medical instruments and moved his chair closer. "Ruth, I need you to tell me everything that happened. Can you do that?" She took a shuddering breath and began. She'd been born enslaved on a plantation in South Carolina, she said. When she was 15, her owner died and his estate was liquidated. She was sold at auction to Edmund Marlowe in 1841, along with several other young people. For the first few months, she worked in the fields at Thornhill, picking cotton during harvest season, doing general agricultural labor. Then one day in September, the overseer, a man named Prescott, came to her in the fields and told her to follow him. She was taken to the cottage, given clean clothes, fed better food than she'd seen in years. She thought perhaps she'd been selected for housework, which would be easier than field work. But that's not what happened, Ruth continued, her voice hollow. Mr. Marlowe came that first night, explained that I'd been chosen for special duties, that I was to stay in that cottage and follow his instructions exactly, that if I cooperated, I'd be treated well. If I didn't, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The threat was always implicit: resist and face punishment, sail to a worse situation, or death. The system ensured compliance through terror. There were 3 other women in the cottage when I arrived, Ruth said. One was maybe 30, had been there for years. She didn't talk much, just sat in her room rocking back and forth. Another was my age, maybe 16. The third was older, maybe 25, and she was pregnant. Marlowe visited regularly, Ruth explained, 2 or 3 times a week. He kept careful records of everything. When he visited, which woman he spent time with, when pregnancies were confirmed. He treated the whole operation like a business venture, which Fielding realized with disgust it essentially was. I got pregnant the first time when I was 18, Ruth said, her voice cracking. I was terrified. I didn't know what would happen to the baby. But they took good care of me during the pregnancy. Better food, lighter work, the midwife checking on me regularly. When I gave birth, it was a boy. He had pale skin, light brown hair. Mr. Marlowe took him away the same day. I never even got to hold him properly. Just saw him for a few minutes before the midwife took him up to the main house. She'd given birth to 3 children during those 6 years. All 3 had pale skin, light hair, features that marked them as different. All 3 were taken away within days of birth. She never knew where they went, never knew if they survived, never got to see them again. The second time I gave birth, it was twins, Ruth said. Girls. They both had blonde hair, blue eyes, beautiful babies. Mr. Marlowe looked at them like they were prize livestock, talking about how much they'd fetch at auction. I begged him to let me keep at least one. He laughed, said I didn't understand economics, said separating them would actually increase their value. Twins being rare, he could sell them to 2 different buyers and tell each one it was unique. More profit that way. Fielding felt sick. The casual cruelty, the pure mercenary calculation, the complete absence of any recognition that these were human beings, not commodities. There were other women who came through while I was there. Ruth continued. Some died in childbirth. There was one girl, couldn't have been more than 16. She hemorrhaged after delivering and they couldn't stop the bleeding. Mr. Barr. Marlowe was angry about losing the investment. Not sad about her death, just angry about the financial loss. Another woman went mad after her third child was taken, started screaming one day and never stopped. They eventually moved her somewhere else, I don't know where. Maybe sold her, maybe just killed her. I don't know. Ruth, Fielding said carefully, would you be willing to testify to this, to what you've told me? If I could find a lawyer or perhaps contact officials in... She laughed, a broken sound without humor. Testify. Testify where, doctor? To whom? Slaves can't testify against white men in Georgia, you know that. I have no legal standing, no rights, no voice that any court would recognize. But if I wrote down what you said, if I documented your account, it wouldn't matter. Ruth's voice was flat, empty of hope. He owns me. Legally, I'm his property to do with as he wishes. Every lawyer, every judge, every lawman in Georgia would say the same thing. There's no law being broken, doctor. That's the horror of it. It's all completely legal. He can do whatever he wants to his property, and the law protects him absolutely. But surely no one cares. Ruth pulled her arm back, wrapping her arms around herself. No one with power cares what happens to enslaved women. We're not people to them. We're property, livestock, investments. What happened to me happens on plantations all across the South, and everyone knows it, and no one does anything because the law is designed to protect owners, not slaves. Fielding sat in silence, feeling the weight of her words. She was right, of course. Everything she'd said about the legal system was correct. There was no recourse within the existing framework. The law itself was the problem. How did you leave Thornhill? He finally asked. Last year, after my third child was born and sold, Mr. Marlowe said I'd served my purpose. I was 24, getting older. He prefers them younger. So he sold me privately to Mr. Wright here in Savannah. Wright thinks he bought a house servant with good health. He doesn't know my history. And if Mr. Marlowe finds out I'm here, that I'm talking about what happened. She didn't need to finish. Fielding understood the danger. If Marlowe learned that Ruth was in Savannah, potentially speaking to people about Thornhill, he had numerous options to silence her. He could claim she was stolen property, demand her return, then sell her again to the Deep South where she'd never be heard from again. Or he could simply have her killed. An enslaved woman's death rarely attracted investigation, especially if the right people were paid to look the other way. Fielding treated Ruth's respiratory infection and gave her medicine for the fever. He also gave her owner, Tobias Wright, instructions that would require keeping Ruth in Savannah for at least a few weeks while she recovered. But 3 days later, when Fielding sent a follow-up inquiry to Wright's household, he was informed that Ruth had been sold. Wright had received an offer he couldn't refuse, $200 more than he'd paid for her just months earlier, from a trader who specialized in moving enslaved people to the Deep South. The trader had mentioned that the buyer was operating on behalf of a client in Alabama who needed house servants. Ruth was already on her way west, beyond Fielding's reach, beyond any possibility of testifying or providing evidence. Fielding didn't need to investigate to know who was behind the sale. Edmund Marlowe had learned that Ruth was in Savannah, had discovered that she'd been to see a physician, and had acted swiftly to eliminate the potential threat. But Fielding had taken one precaution. During Ruth's visit, while examining her, he'd asked her to repeat her entire story while he took extensive notes, writing down everything she said in careful detail. He'd dated and signed the document, then locked it in his trunk with the rest of his Thornhill research. It wasn't legal testimony. It wouldn't hold up in court. But it was documentation, evidence, a record that someone had cared enough to preserve her story. If the system ever changed, if somehow justice became possible, Fielding wanted Ruth's testimony to exist. He had no idea how long that would take. He couldn't imagine it would be 13 years before slavery itself fell, and even then justice would prove elusive. But the documentation would survive. Sometimes that was all one could do. Sarah Clemens was an anomaly in 1848 Georgia, a woman who wrote for publication, who asked uncomfortable questions, who refused to limit her interests to domestic matters and social events. She published under her brother's name, Charles Clemens, of course. No newspaper would run articles written by women. The byline C. Clemens appeared regularly in the Georgia Sentinel on articles covering politics, economics, and social issues. But it was Sarah's research, Sarah's interviews, Sarah's unflinching prose that appeared in print whenever uncomfortable truths needed telling. She'd grown up in Savannah, the daughter of a shipping merchant who'd believed in educating his daughters as thoroughly as his sons. She'd learned to read Latin, studied mathematics and history, corresponded with northern intellectuals who sent her books and newspapers not available in Georgia. She'd developed a writer's eye for detail and a journalist's instinct for finding stories beneath the official narratives. By 1848, at 29 years old, she'd established herself as one of the more insightful political commentators in Georgia, even if most readers assumed she was her brother Charles, who worked in their father's shipping office and happily took credit for his sister's work. Sarah had heard whispers about Thornhill Plantation for years. Rumors circulated in the kinds of social circles she moved through, careful coded references to Edmund Marlowe's unusual operations, knowing looks when particularly pale enslaved children appeared at auctions, whispered speculation about the cottage behind his main house. But whispers weren't evidence. Rumors weren't facts. And Sarah had learned through painful experience that accusations without proof were worse than useless. They could destroy credibility, close doors that might otherwise open, and give targets ammunition to dismiss legitimate criticism as gossip and scandal-mongering. Then, in October of 1848, Dr. Marcus Fielding contacted her. The introduction came through mutual acquaintances in Savannah's small community of moderately progressive professionals, people who weren't abolitionists exactly, but who were troubled by some of slavery's worst excesses. Fielding had asked around carefully, looking for someone who might have the skills and courage to investigate Thornhill Plantation properly. Several people suggested Sarah Clemens, though they cautioned that she would need ironclad evidence before she'd pursue the story publicly. They met in a boarding house on West Broad Street, a discreet location where neither would attract particular attention. Fielding arrived with a leather satchel containing his documentation. Sarah brought her notebook and her well-practiced ability to maintain a neutral expression even when hearing disturbing information. Fielding spread his papers across a table in a rented room: birth registries, auction records, death certificates, medical notes, Ruth's testimony, Thomas Hayes's courthouse documentation. Years of careful research, names and dates and descriptions building an irrefutable pattern. Sarah read through everything carefully, making notes, asking pointed questions, cross-referencing documents. It took nearly 3 hours. When she finally looked up, her expression was dark with suppressed anger. "This is systematic," she said. "This isn't opportunistic abuse or scattered incidents. This is deliberate, organized, sustained over decades. It's an industrial operation. At least 3 decades that I can document clearly," Fielding agreed. "I suspect it goes back further, possibly to the 1780s or even earlier, but records before 1820 are incomplete or missing. The Marlowe family has owned Thornhill since the 1760s. 3 generations, Sarah murmured, making notes. "A family tradition of—" She stopped, unable to find words adequate to the horror. 21 children documented between 1830 and 1848, Fielding continued. But there are references in burial records and fragmentary documents suggesting at least 15 more going back to 1820. That's 36 verified cases. The actual number is almost certainly higher. And they're sold as infants or toddlers, Sarah said, reviewing the auction records. Always to distant plantations, different counties, sometimes different states, always separated from their mothers within months of birth. The pattern is designed specifically to prevent anyone from seeing it, from compiling this kind of comprehensive documentation. Exactly. Each buyer sees one unusual child, assumes it's an isolated incident, an affair perhaps, something not worth questioning. But when you compile all the records together, The pattern becomes undeniable. Sarah closed her notebook and looked at Fielding directly. Dr. Fielding, you understand that I can't publish this. Even writing under my brother's name, no editor in Georgia would run it. Edmund Marlowe could sue for libel. He could demand proof. And while your documentation is extensive, none of it would hold up in court as proof of what he's actually done. Ruth's testimony is inadmissible, Sarah interrupted. She's enslaved. Her word means nothing legally. Even if she were free, even if we found a dozen women willing to testify, any defense attorney would argue that these children could have any number of fathers. Prove it was Marlowe. Prove it wasn't consensual. Prove it wasn't some other white man on the plantation, an overseer, a visitor, anyone. There's no way to establish paternity without Marlowe's confession, and he'll never confess. Fielding slammed his palm on the table, making the documents jump. So we do nothing? We have documentation of at least 36 children. We have testimony from a woman who was imprisoned in that cottage for 6 years. We have statistical evidence that's mathematically impossible to explain any other way, and we do nothing. I didn't say that. Sarah's voice was calm but firm. I said we can't publish direct accusations, but there are other approaches. More subtle, more strategic. We document everything. We continue building the case. And we publish what we can publish. Statistical anomalies, questions about accountability in birth documentation, analysis of auction patterns. We make people aware that something strange is happening without making specific accusations that could be legally challenged. That's not enough. It's what's possible, Sarah said. Dr. Fielding, you're a good man and a brave researcher, but you need to understand the world we're working in. This is Georgia in 1848. The entire legal, economic, and social system is designed to protect slavery and the people who profit from it. Edmund Marlowe is a wealthy, powerful, politically connected member of that system. He has resources we can't match. He has legal protections we can't penetrate, and most importantly, he's not actually breaking any laws. How is that possible? Because the law defines children's status by their mother's condition. Partus sequitur ventrum, the offspring follows the condition of the mother. It's been law in the South since the 1660s. If a woman is enslaved, her children are enslaved, regardless of who fathered them. That's not a loophole, Doctor. That's the foundational principle of how slavery reproduces itself generation after generation. By that principle, Edmund Marlowe is simply managing his property. The law sees no crime. The law is evil. Yes, Sarah agreed quietly. It is, and changing that law will require changing the entire system, which will happen eventually. I believe that. But it won't happen through a newspaper article exposing one plantation owner. It will require political transformation, probably violence, possibly war. The system is too entrenched, too profitable, too deeply woven into Southern society to reform peacefully. They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the enormity of what they were up against. So what do we do? Fielding finally asked. Sarah gathered the papers, organizing them carefully. We document everything we can. We keep meticulous records. We prepare for the day when this system finally falls, when testimony might actually matter, when justice might actually be possible. We find allies, other physicians, other researchers, people in other states who might have influence. And we try to find one thing, one piece of evidence that even this society can't ignore. Such as, I don't know yet, but we keep looking, we keep researching, and we don't give up even when it seems hopeless. Over the following months, Sarah and Dr. Fielding formed an unlikely partnership. Sarah had connections throughout Savannah society, access to records and information that Fielding couldn't reach as an outsider. Fielding had medical expertise and access to enslaved patients who might provide testimony or information. Together, they expanded the investigation beyond Thornhill Plantation, looking for similar patterns at other estates. And what they found was, in some ways, even more disturbing than Thornhill itself. In 1851, 3 years after Sarah and Dr. Fielding began their collaborative research, Sarah published an article in the Georgia Sentinel under her brother's byline. It was titled Statistical Irregularities in County Birth Records, a call for improved documentation. The article was carefully crafted to avoid direct accusations. It presented statistical analysis of slave birth records across 3 Georgia counties, Chatham, Liberty, and Glynn. It noted that certain plantations produced statistically improbable numbers of children with unusual physical characteristics, not consistent with documented maternal lineage. It referenced the legal principle of partus sequitur ventrum and discussed its implications for property law and inheritance. It raised careful questions about accountability and documentation practices, suggesting that more rigorous record-keeping might be necessary to prevent fraud in property transfers. The article never mentioned Thornhill Plantation by name. It never accused Edmund Marlowe. It presented itself as a dry, academic discussion of documentation practices and statistical anomalies. But anyone reading carefully, anyone familiar with the situation, understood exactly what Sarah was documenting. The article caused a minor scandal. 2 newspapers in South Carolina republished it, with editorial notes praising its rigorous analysis. 3 Georgia newspapers wrote editorials condemning it as abolitionist propaganda disguised as scholarship, claiming that questioning birth records was an attack on property rights and Southern institutions. One state legislator, Senator Harold Wickham, gave a speech on the floor of the Georgia General Assembly defending the sanctity of property rights and dismissing concerns about birth irregularities as Northern interference in Southern affairs. He didn't mention Thornhill Plantation either, but his vehemence suggested he knew exactly what Sarah's article was really discussing. The controversy lasted about 2 weeks, then faded as other news dominated public attention. But Sarah Clemens received 7 letters. They arrived over the course of 6 weeks, forwarded through the newspaper's offices to C. Clemens. Each letter was written by a woman, some enslaved, some free, some writing through intermediaries who transcribed their words. Each described similar patterns at different plantations across the South. The first letter came from Augusta, Georgia. A free woman of color named Martha Daniels wrote describing conditions at a plantation where she'd been enslaved until purchasing her freedom in 1847. She described a separate house where young women were kept, systematic pregnancies, light-skinned children sold away quickly. She estimated at least 12 such children during the 5 years she was there. The second letter came from Montgomery, Alabama. It was unsigned, written in an educated hand that suggested someone from outside the enslaved community was serving as scribe. It described 2 plantations in Alabama where similar operations existed, providing dates and approximate numbers of children. The third letter was the most detailed. It came from a free woman of color in New Orleans named Josephine Mercier, who'd purchased her own freedom years earlier after saving money for nearly a decade. Her letter was 8 pages long, meticulously detailed, heartbreaking in its precision. She wrote, "Mr. Clemens, I read your article about birth irregularities with great interest. I know there were at least 20 children born during my time at the Beauregard Plantation in Louisiana, all sold before their 5th birthday. I was 14 when I was first taken to the separate house. I gave birth to 3 children in 4 years. I never saw any of them after they were 6 months old. When I finally raised enough money to purchase my freedom, the owner let me go gladly. I think he was relieved to have me gone, to have one less witness to what was happening. What you describe in Georgia is not unique. It is a system, replicated across the South wherever powerful men believe they are above accountability. I am writing to you because someone must document this. The women who are still enslaved cannot speak. Those of us who are free are often too frightened to speak, knowing we could be re-enslaved on false pretenses if we anger the wrong people. But someone must create a record, must preserve testimony, must ensure that future generations know what happened, even if our generation lacks the courage or power to stop it. I can provide names, dates, descriptions of at least 20 children I personally witnessed being born and sold. I can describe the house where we were kept, the conditions, the systematic nature of the operation. I can testify to everything, though I understand my testimony has no legal value. I do not know if documenting these crimes will change anything, but I know that silence is complicity. If the only thing I can do is ensure that this evil is recorded, witnessed, remembered, then I will do that. Please continue your research. Please continue publishing whatever you can. Some of us are watching, hoping, praying that someday, somehow justice will become possible." Sarah read Josephine's letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. This woman, who'd endured horrors Sarah could barely imagine, was still fighting, still documenting, still believing that truth mattered even when justice seemed impossible. The remaining 4 letters described similar situations in South Carolina, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Virginia. Different plantations, different owners, identical patterns. Separate houses, selected women, systematic pregnancies, light-skinned children sold away quickly to distant estates. Sarah compiled all the letters, cross-referenced the information, verified what she could through available records. The pattern was vast. At least 9 plantations across 6 states, operating similar systems, producing potentially hundreds of children over decades. And these were only the cases that Sarah and Dr. Fielding could document from letters and available records. How many other plantations were running similar operations without leaving any trace in accessible documentation? The scale was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't about Thornhill Plantation. This was about a systematic exploitation enabled by legal principles that treated enslaved women's bodies as property, their children as commodities, their suffering as invisible. Dr. Fielding reviewed the letters and added them to his research documentation. Together, he and Sarah now had evidence of systematic abuse across 6 states, involving dozens of plantations, potentially thousands of children over several decades. And they still had no way to make it public without being destroyed legally and professionally. No way to achieve justice within the existing system. No way to help the women who were still imprisoned in those cottages and separate houses across the South. All they could do was document, research, preserve testimony, and wait for the system to change, knowing that change might be years or decades away. While Sarah focused on collecting testimony and documenting patterns across multiple states, Dr. Fielding expanded his research into death records. If birth records showed one pattern, he reasoned, perhaps death records would reveal another part of the story. What he found was, in some ways, even more disturbing than the living children. Cemetery records for estates like Thornhill often listed enslaved burials in cursory detail. The law required some documentation of property losses, including deaths, but the documentation could be minimal. A typical entry might read, infant aged 2 months, natural causes, or female aged approximately 30, fever with no names, no family connections, no specifics. But occasionally, particularly in older records kept by more meticulous plantation managers, someone had noted additional details. Ages in months rather than years. Physical descriptions, causes of death described with unusual specificity. In the burial records for Thornhill Plantation going back to 1785, Fielding found references to 22 infants and young children described as light-complexioned, unusual appearance, or European features, buried between ages ranging from newborn to 4 years old. 22 dead children, 21 sold. That was 43 children documented over approximately 6 decades, with records likely incomplete for the earlier decades. The causes of death varied, but followed patterns familiar to any physician: respiratory infections, dysentery, fever, complications of childbirth. The normal hazards of infant and child mortality in the 18th and 19th centuries, when even wealthy white children died at shocking rates. But these weren't wealthy white children. These were enslaved infants, born in a cottage, torn from their mothers, cared for by whoever was assigned the task while waiting to be sold. What kind of care did they receive? Were they kept warm in winter? Fed properly? Held when they cried? Or were they simply maintained like livestock until they could be transported to auction? Fielding thought about those 22 dead children often. 22 graves, probably unmarked, in the enslaved cemetery at Thornhill Plantation. No monuments, no headstones, no remembrance beyond brief notations in a property loss ledger. For every child sold at auction, another had died before sale. The arithmetic was grim, a roughly 50% survival rate, which was actually better than average for enslaved infants, but devastating when you thought about what it represented. And if the pattern at Thornhill was replicated at the other plantations Sarah had documented, 9 estates producing similar numbers over similar timeframes, the total death count could be hundreds of children who never made it to auction, who died as infants, whose existence was noted only as property losses. Fielding expanded his cemetery research, requesting access to burial records from other plantations where he had reason to suspect similar operations. The research was painstaking, requiring careful diplomacy and plausible explanations for his interest. He claimed to be conducting a medical study on infant mortality rates, which was true enough, though he carefully avoided mentioning the specific patterns he was investigating. Over 18 months, he compiled death records from 14 plantations across Georgia and South Carolina. The pattern held. Estates that produced unusually high numbers of light-skinned children who were sold also showed unusual numbers of infant deaths for children described with similar characteristics. The total numbers were staggering. At least 67 children documented as sold, at least 43 documented as died before sale. And those were only the ones clearly documented in accessible records spanning incomplete decades. The true numbers, counting all the plantations, all the years, all the cases that went undocumented, could easily be double or triple that. Could be 1,000 children or more, spread across the South over a century, their births and deaths reduced to accounting entries in property ledgers. Fielding added the cemetery research to his trunk of documentation. It was growing into an enormous collection now. Hundreds of pages of records, testimony, statistical analysis, proof of systematic exploitation on a scale that should shock anyone who saw it. But who could he show it to? Who had both the power and the willingness to act? He had no answer. So he continued documenting, continued adding to the record, and hoped that someday, somehow, the evidence would matter. On the night of August 12, 1848, fire erupted at Thornhill Plantation. It started in the separate cottage, the isolated building behind the main house where women had been imprisoned for 50 years. The fire was visible from the main house at approximately 10 o'clock at night, flames already reaching toward the dark Georgia sky, consuming the wooden structure with terrifying speed. Edmund Marlowe woke to one of his domestic servants pounding on his bedroom door, shouting about fire. He dressed quickly and ran outside, where he could see the cottage fully engulfed, flames shooting through the roof, the entire structure glowing like a torch against the night. He immediately organized enslaved workers into a bucket line from the well, trying to contain the fire and prevent it from spreading to other buildings. But the cottage was too far gone, the fire too intense, burning too fast. Within an hour, the cottage had collapsed into smoldering ruins, nothing remaining but the stone foundation and piles of burning wood. The heat was so intense that no one could approach until dawn, when the ashes had cooled enough to search the wreckage. 4 bodies were found in the ruins, burned beyond recognition, identified only by their locations in what had been 4 separate rooms. The overseer counted the plantation's population and confirmed that 4 women who'd been housed in the cottage were unaccounted for. Their names, recorded in the official report filed with Chatham County, Hannah, Ruth, Grace, and Mary. Ages listed as approximately 22, 25, 19, and 28. Value listed as $600, $500, $300, and $700 respectively. Total property loss, $2,100 for the women, plus $500 for the structure. The official report, filed by Sheriff William Dixon after a cursory investigation, concluded, fire of accidental origin, likely caused by overturned lantern. No evidence of foul play. Regrettable loss of property. There was no investigation into why 4 women had been unable to escape a fire that was visible from hundreds of yards away. No one asked why the cottage had bars on its windows, visible in the ruins. No one questioned why the doors had been locked from the outside, the bolts still in place where they'd fallen among the ashes. No one inquired about the charred remains of shackles found among the debris, or the fact that all 4 bodies had been found in their respective rooms, suggesting they'd been trapped inside when the fire started. Edmund Marlowe accepted condolences from his neighbors for his unfortunate loss of property. He filed an insurance claim for the value of the women and the structure, which was paid without dispute. He made arrangements for the bodies to be buried in the Enslaved cemetery at Thornhill, though no markers were erected. And he announced plans to rebuild the cottage, claiming it had been useful for quarantining sick workers and would be missed. But rumors began to spread among the enslaved community at Thornhill and neighboring plantations. Whispered stories that moved like water through channels invisible to white society. Stories about what those women had endured. Stories about the children taken from them. Stories about one woman who'd found matches hidden in the kitchen stores, who'd chosen death over continued captivity, who'd set the fire knowing she and the others would die, but determined to end the horror, even if ending it meant ending their own lives. The rumors said it was Hannah who'd started the fire. Hannah, aged 22, who'd been in the cottage for 4 years. Hannah, who'd given birth to 3 children and watched all 3 taken away. Hannah, who'd been scheduled to give birth to a 4th child within weeks. The rumors said she decided she wouldn't bring another child into that nightmare, that she'd rather burn than produce one more baby for Edmund Marlowe to sell, that she'd told the other women what she planned, and they'd agreed. Death was preferable to continuing. The rumors said that when the fire started, the women didn't scream. They didn't pound on the doors or beg for help. They sat in their rooms and let the smoke take them, choosing their own ending rather than submitting to more years of systematic abuse. Dr. Fielding heard the rumors through his patients. An enslaved woman he was treating for pneumonia, who had a cousin at Thornhill, who'd heard from someone in the quarters that Hannah had said something about ending it a few days before the fire, that she'd seemed calm, resigned, almost peaceful in a way she hadn't been in years. Sarah Clemens heard the rumors through her sources, the network of domestic workers and free people of color who moved through Savannah society and carried information that white people rarely heard. Stories about Hannah's determination, about the other women agreeing, about a collective decision to die rather than continue. Neither could verify the rumors, neither could publish them. There was no evidence beyond whispered stories, and even if there had been evidence, what good would it do? 4 enslaved women had died in a fire. The law saw it as property loss, nothing more. Their choices, their resistance, their final act of defiance. All of it was invisible to the legal system. But Dr. Fielding added a note to his documentation. August 12th, 1848. Fire at Thornhill Plantation. 4 women dead. Hannah, 22. Ruth, 25. Grace, 19. Mary, 28. Official cause, accidental. Unofficial reports suggest deliberate act of resistance. Unable to verify. And Sarah wrote in her private journal, if the rumors are true, then Hannah and the others made the only choice available to them. They couldn't escape, couldn't testify, couldn't seek justice. But they could refuse to continue, could deny Marlowe any more children, could choose their own death rather than submit to more abuse. If that's true, then they were braver than any of us who remain alive and complicit in this evil system. 1 week after the fire, Edmund Marlowe announced significant changes to his operations at Thornhill Plantation. He would be retiring from active management of the estate, he declared. He was getting older, approaching his mid-50s, and he wanted to spend more time in Charleston with his son's family. Thornhill would be managed by a hired overseer with strict instructions to run it as a conventional cotton operation. The cottage would not be rebuilt. The special breeding program was being discontinued. To anyone watching carefully, it looked like retreat, like a man who'd lost his nerve, whose operation had become too visible, too risky. The fire had killed 4 women and attracted more attention than Marlowe wanted. Perhaps he'd decided the profit wasn't worth the increased scrutiny. But it also looked like a man who'd gotten away with everything, who'd operated a systematic program of abuse for decades, produced dozens of children who were sold as property, and now was retiring comfortably with his wealth intact, his reputation unblemished, facing no consequences whatsoever. The law was on his side. It had always been on his side. And it would remain on his side until the entire system came crashing down. After the fire, Dr. Fielding tried to push for a more thorough investigation. He approached Sheriff Dixon, carefully suggesting that the circumstances of the fire seemed suspicious. 4 women dead, all in separate rooms, unable to escape a building that should have been easy to flee. Dixon listened politely, then explained the obvious. "Dr. Fielding, these were enslaved women. They were property. The owner has suffered a significant financial loss, but there's no evidence of crime here. Accidents happen, fires occur, the matter is closed. But the bars on the windows, the locked doors, were normal security measures for valuable property. Mr. Marlowe had invested considerable resources in those women. He naturally wanted to protect his investment from escape or outside interference." The logic was circular, self-reinforcing, impenetrable. The women were property, therefore normal property protection measures applied. Therefore their inability to escape was a regrettable accident rather than a crime. Fielding tried approaching Judge Pembroke, suggesting that perhaps a formal inquest should be held, given the unusual circumstances. The judge smiled patronizingly and said, "Doctor, I understand you're new to Georgia, and perhaps don't fully grasp how we handle these matters. An inquest would serve no purpose. The women are dead. There's no one to prosecute even if there were evidence of crime, and Mr. Marlowe has already suffered significant property loss. Let the matter rest." "But, Your Honor—" "Let it rest, Dr. Fielding." The judge's voice went hard. "I'm saying this as friendly advice. Edmund Marlowe is a powerful man with influential friends. Pursuing unfounded accusations against him would be very unwise for your career and your future in Georgia. Do you understand me?" The threat was barely veiled. "Back off or face consequences." Fielding backed off. What choice did he have? He had no power, no legal authority, no recourse within the system. And pushing further would likely result in him being driven out of Georgia, unable to practice medicine, his research confiscated or destroyed. So he documented what he could and waited. Sarah Clemens had similar experiences when she tried, very carefully, to investigate the fire through her journalistic contacts. She encountered walls everywhere, refusals to discuss the matter, threats of libel suits if she published anything, doors that suddenly closed when she asked questions about Thornhill Plantation. Edmund Marlowe's power in Savannah society was absolute. He'd been a major figure for decades, knew everyone, held financial leverage over many people through business dealings and loans. No one would risk their position by speaking out against him, especially not to investigate the deaths of 4 enslaved women that the law considered mere property loss. The investigation that should have happened never occurred. The justice that should have been sought was never pursued. And Edmund Marlowe faced no consequences whatsoever for his role in creating the conditions that led to 4 deaths. Instead, he retired with honor, moved to Charleston, was remembered fondly in Savannah as a successful planter and respectable member of society. The 4 women were buried in unmarked graves and forgotten by everyone except those who'd known them and those who documented their story in private records that wouldn't be read for decades. In 1854, 6 years after the Thornhill fire, Rebecca Hartwell, now 32 years old and managing her late uncle's auction house, received a letter that would change her life. The letter was from a planter in Florida, inquiring about upcoming sales. The writer was looking to purchase field hands and domestic servants for a new plantation he was establishing. He mentioned almost casually that he'd heard Savannah auctions occasionally featured unusual specimens, specifically light-skinned children from special breeding programs who could be employed as house servants rather than field workers. Rebecca read the letter 3 times, feeling increasingly nauseated with each reading. The horror had become a market category, a known commodity, a thing that planters discussed casually in business correspondence, sought out deliberately, valued specifically for the circumstances of its creation. The systematic rape and exploitation that produced these children wasn't a shameful secret anymore. It was a recognized feature of the market, something buyers actively looked for, sellers advertised subtly, and auction houses were expected to facilitate. Rebecca Hartwell sat at her uncle's old desk, her desk now, she supposed, though she'd never wanted the business, and stared at the letter. This was what she'd been doing all these years, not just selling enslaved people, which was horrible enough. but facilitating the sale of children who'd been produced through systematic abuse, children whose very existence represented generational exploitation. She'd told herself she was just keeping records, just managing the business, that she wasn't personally responsible for the horrors of slavery. But that was a lie. Everyone who participated in the system, even in administrative roles, was complicit. She wrote back to the Florida planter declining his inquiry, saying her auction house didn't specialize in such sales and wouldn't be able to help him. Then she closed the business entirely. Her family was horrified. The auction house was profitable and established business with decades of history. Why would she shut it down? Because I can't be part of it anymore, Rebecca told them. I can't maintain even the pretense of professional distance. What we're facilitating, it's evil, and I'm done. She used the proceeds from selling the business to purchase passage to Philadelphia, leaving Georgia entirely. She'd later say it was the only way she could live with herself, get as far from the system as possible, refuse any further complicity. But she kept her private ledger, the one where she documented all the unusual children who'd passed through her uncle's auction house between 1843 and 1854. 12 children total, all from Thornhill Plantation, all sold to distant estates, all bearing the marks of systematic abuse in their origin. When the Civil War began in 1861, Rebecca sent that ledger to Dr. Fielding in Savannah, along with a note. I should have done more. We all should have done more, but at least we documented. At least someone will know. The approaching storm. By 1857, Georgia was approaching a breaking point. The entire South was. Debates over slavery's expansion into new territories dominated politics. Abolitionist literature circulated secretly, passed hand to hand, despite laws criminalizing its possession. The Underground Railroad moved people north toward freedom in increasing numbers. Violence erupted in Kansas and Missouri as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces clashed. Everyone could sense that some kind of resolution was coming, though no one knew what form it would take. War seemed increasingly likely. Peaceful resolution seemed increasingly impossible. Dr. Fielding, now in his early 40s, continued practicing medicine and maintaining his documentation. His trunk of records had grown enormous. Dozens of thick ledgers containing birth records, death records, testimony, statistical analysis, maps showing the movement of enslaved children across 6 states, cemetery documentation, auction house records. He had documentation of 68 children now, sold or died, produced by breeding programs, across 9 plantations over 7 decades. 68 documented cases, with the certainty that many more had gone unrecorded. Sarah Clemens had married a merchant named Robert Gaines, taking his name, continuing her writing under various pseudonyms. She'd compiled testimony from 19 women, all free now through various means, all willing to describe what they'd endured. But none of it could be published. Not yet. Not in Georgia in 1857. They both waited for the political situation to shift, for some crack in the system that might allow truth to emerge and justice to be sought. The crack came eventually, but not in the way anyone expected. It came with cannons firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861, with Georgia seceding from the Union, with war sweeping across the South and tearing apart the society that had protected men like Edmund Marlowe for generations. When Georgia seceded in January 1861, Edmund Marlowe was 69 years old, living comfortably in Charleston with his son's family. Thornhill Plantation continued operating under management of hired overseers, producing cotton for the Confederate war effort. The war initially seemed distant from Chatham County. There was enthusiasm for the Confederacy, confidence that the North would be quickly defeated. Young men enlisted. Plantations continued operating. Life proceeded with relative normalcy for the first 2 years. Then the Union naval blockade began to bite. Cotton couldn't be exported. Prices collapsed. Plantations that had been enormously profitable suddenly struggled. Food became scarce. The war came closer. By 1864, Sherman's army was marching through Georgia, burning plantations, destroying infrastructure, freeing enslaved people wherever they went. The world that had protected men like Marlowe was coming apart. In December 1864, Union forces reached Chatham County. Thornhill Plantation was seized as rebel property, the main house occupied by Union officers as temporary headquarters. The enslaved population was declared free under military order, though the practical meaning of that freedom remained unclear. Federal officers began cataloging the plantation's assets: land, equipment, buildings, records. They were looking for evidence of the plantation's value and productivity, information needed for eventual decisions about property confiscation or restoration. A young captain from Massachusetts, Francis Whitmore, was assigned to inventory the main house's contents. He worked methodically through the rooms, documenting furniture, artwork, books, papers. In the attic, he found a locked trunk. Breaking the lock, expecting to find valuables or perhaps Confederate documents, Captain Whitmore instead found ledgers. Dozens of ledgers dating back decades, meticulously maintained. At first, he thought they were ordinary plantation records, crop production, sales figures, property inventories. But as he began reading, his hands started shaking. The ledgers documented the cottage operation in precise detail. Which women were selected when, based on what criteria. When each woman became pregnant. Physical descriptions of the children born. Which children survived. Which died. Sale prices for those sold. Dates, names, buyers, locations. It was a business ledger for systematic rape and child trafficking, maintained across 3 generations of the Marlowe family. Captain Whitmore made it through 3 pages before he had to step outside and vomit. When he returned, he forced himself to continue reading, documenting what he found. By the end, he'd identified records of 79 children born in the cottage between 1780 and 1848, with varying levels of detail. 79 children. Nearly 80 lives, documented like livestock breeding records, their existence reduced to accounting entries tracking investments and returns. Whitmore sent the trunk to his commanding officer with a note. "Sir, I have found documentation of crimes that I lack the vocabulary to describe. These records should be preserved as evidence and forwarded to appropriate authorities for possible prosecution." His commanding officer, Colonel James Hartley, reviewed the ledgers and agreed. The trunk was logged, catalogued, and sent to the Department of War in Washington, where it would be reviewed by military justice officials and potentially used in prosecutions against Confederate leaders for war crimes. But the war was still raging. Prosecutors were overwhelmed with cases. The trunk was filed, stored, added to an enormous backlog of confiscated documents awaiting review. It would remain in storage for years, buried in a warehouse full of similar documentation, one horror among thousands, waiting for officials who had time and resources to examine it. The war ended in April 1865. Slavery was abolished by constitutional amendment in December 1865. Approximately 4 million enslaved people were suddenly, legally free. And then came the question, what does freedom mean? What comes next? The legal structure that had protected systematic exploitation for centuries had collapsed. But the people who'd profited from that system were still alive, still powerful, still determined to maintain control. Edmund Marlowe died in Charleston in July 1866 at age 74, before any prosecutions could be initiated based on the documentation found at Thornhill. His obituary in the Charleston newspaper described him as a pillar of the community, successful planter, devoted father. There was no mention of the cottage, the women, the children. His son, Edmund Marlowe Jr., who'd been educated in Charleston and claimed to know nothing about his father's operations, inherited Thornhill Plantation. Under post-war property restoration agreements, many confiscated estates were returned to their original owners' families. Thornhill was among them, restored to Edmund Jr. in 1868. The trunk of ledgers remained in Washington, still unprocessed, still waiting for review that kept being delayed as Reconstruction politics consumed all available attention and resources. Dr. Fielding published his research in 1868 in a Northern medical journal, framed as a case study in the medical and ethical implications of slavery. The article, titled "Systematic Exploitation and Its Health Consequences, a Retrospective Analysis of Georgia Plantation Practices," documented his findings without naming specific plantations or individuals. It described the pattern: separate housing, selected women, systematic pregnancies, Children sold in infancy. It provided statistical analysis showing the scale of the practice. It discussed the physical and psychological health consequences for the women involved. It concluded with a call for further research into slavery's health impacts and the long-term effects of systematic exploitation. The article was read by approximately 200 people, mostly physicians and academics. It was discussed at several medical conferences. One newspaper wrote a brief summary. Then it faded from attention as the nation moved on to other concerns. Sarah Gaines, formerly Clemens, published a longer account in 1872 under her own name for the first time. The book, titled The Invisible Ones, an account of systematic injustice in Georgia, was more personal, more accusatory, more detailed than Fielding's academic article. It included testimony from 12 women who'd agreed to have their stories published, including Josephine Mercier's detailed account from Louisiana. It provided specific descriptions of plantation operations at Thornhill and 2 other estates that Sarah felt safe naming now that the owners were dead or legally powerless. It named Edmund Marlowe explicitly as the operator of Thornhill's breeding program and accused him posthumously of crimes against humanity, even if not crimes under the laws that had existed during his lifetime. The book sold fewer than 300 copies. Critics largely ignored it. Those who reviewed it generally dismissed it as outdated grievance literature or sensationalist post-war propaganda. One reviewer wrote, "Mrs. Gaines seems determined to prolong animosity over matters that are now, thankfully, in the past. With slavery abolished, this kind of documentation serves no purpose except to prevent national healing." The book went out of print within 2 years. Sarah tried to interest other publishers in a second edition, but none were interested. The nation, they told her, was tired of slavery stories. People wanted to move forward, not dwell on the past. Sarah kept writing, publishing articles under various names on Reconstruction politics, women's rights, racial justice. But she never achieved significant readership or influence. She died in 1889, largely forgotten, her book unavailable, her testimony ignored. The trunk of Marlowe family ledgers sat in federal storage until 1889, when a clerk finally processed it as part of a warehouse clearing project. 24 years after the war, someone finally reviewed its contents in detail. The clerk, a man named William Pearson, read through the ledgers with increasing horror. He filed a report with his supervisor, noting that the documents appeared to show evidence of irregular practices at Georgia Plantation, 1780-1848, possibly constituting crimes even under laws existing at the time. His supervisor reviewed the report and responded, "Case is of historical interest only. All principals are deceased. Plantation in question has been returned to family ownership. No basis for prosecution or property confiscation at this time. File for archival purposes." The trunk was catalogued as Confiscated Property Records, Georgia, 1861-1865, Marlowe Family, Thornhill Plantation. It was placed in permanent storage at the National Archives, where it remains to this day, available to researchers who specifically request it, but essentially unknown to the general public. No further action was taken, no prosecutions pursued, no official acknowledgement of what the ledgers documented. The case was closed. Of the 68 children, Dr. Fielding had documented during his lifetime of research, he managed to trace the fates of 11 before he died in 1883. 4 had died before age 10. Disease, accidents, the casual brutalities of slavery. 1 had escaped north before the war, made it to Canada, lived under an assumed name, never returned south. 3 had survived to see emancipation in 1865 and disappeared into the mass migration of freed people looking for family, work, new lives. No one knew what happened to them. 2 had been found by family members after the war, reunions made possible by the Freedmen's Bureau's desperate attempt to help people find each other in the chaos of Reconstruction. Both had been sold as infants to plantations in South Carolina, had been raised enslaved, worked as domestic servants, survived the war. When freed, they'd spent years searching for their mothers, placing advertisements in newspapers, asking questions, following rumors. One woman named Margaret found her mother in 1869 in Augusta, Georgia. The reunion was bittersweet. 23 years separated, barely recognizing each other, connected only by the mother's memory of a light-skinned infant taken from her arms. They stayed in contact until the mother's death in 1875, trying to rebuild a relationship across a chasm of lost decades. And one woman, named Charlotte, made her way back to Georgia, specifically to find out what happened to her mother. Charlotte had been sold from Thornhill as a toddler in 1830, purchased by a family in Mississippi. She'd spent her entire life enslaved, working as a domestic servant, never knowing anything about her origins beyond vague memories of being very young and suddenly somewhere else. When emancipation came, she was 39 years old, married to another freed person, mother to 3 children of her own. She'd learned to read through a missionary school in Mississippi and began searching for information about where she came from. Through careful research, patient questions, and help from Freedmen's Bureau workers, she eventually traced her origins to Thornhill Plantation. In 1869, she traveled to Georgia with her eldest daughter, both of them determined to learn the truth. The overseer at Thornhill, a different man now, hired after the war, trying to run the plantation with paid workers rather than enslaved labor, was uncomfortable with her questions but eventually let her access the old records. Charlotte and her daughter spent hours searching through burial records, property ledgers, birth registries. Finally, they found an entry. Hannah, age approximately 35, died August 1848. Fire. Property loss $600. Charlotte stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the page, staring at her mother's name reduced to one line in a ledger. Hannah. She'd never known her mother's name. Now she knew her name and the fact that she'd died in a fire 21 years ago. "Is there anything else?" the overseer asked, uncomfortable with the silence. Charlotte wanted to ask more. She wanted to know what her mother had looked like, what she'd been like as a person, whether she'd tried to keep her baby, whether she'd mourned when Charlotte was sold. But the records contained none of that. Her mother was just a line in a ledger, a property loss, a death noted for insurance purposes. "The fire," Charlotte finally said. "What happened?" The overseer shrugged. "Before my time. I heard there was a fire in one of the buildings. Some workers died. Accidental, I think." "Do you know where she's buried?" "Enslaved cemetery is out past the fields. No markers. But if she died in 1848, she'd be in the section from that era. 20 years ago, so probably..." He vaguely gestured toward the east side of the property. Charlotte and her daughter walked to the enslaved cemetery at Thornhill Plantation. It was overgrown, neglected, no headstones or markers. Just a field where approximately 300 people had been buried over 8 decades of plantation operations. Their graves unmarked, their names unremembered. Charlotte stood in that field, looking at the overgrown grass, trying to figure out where her mother might be buried. But it was impossible. All the graves were anonymous, indistinguishable, deliberately unmarked because enslaved people weren't considered worthy of permanent memorials. Her daughter asked, "What should we do?" Charlotte thought about that question for a long time. What could they do? Her mother was dead, had been dead for 21 years. The man who'd enslaved her, who'd imprisoned her, who'd taken her baby, was dead too. The system that had enabled it all was legally abolished, though its effects continued. "We remember," Charlotte finally said. "Hannah, that was her name. Hannah, who died in 1848 in a fire at Thornhill Plantation, who was my mother, who I never got to know. We remember her, and we make sure our children know about her, and maybe that's all we can do." They left Thornhill that afternoon and never returned. But Charlotte told the story of Hannah to her children and grandchildren. The story of a woman enslaved in Georgia, imprisoned in a cottage, who'd somehow brought a daughter into that nightmare and then died in a fire under mysterious circumstances. The story passed down through generations, modified over time, details lost and added, but the core remaining. There was a woman named Hannah who suffered terribly and deserves to be remembered. The courthouse in Chatham County still holds the birth registries, the auction records, the documentation of 21 children sold from Thornhill Plantation between 1830 and 1847. The numbers are certainly higher, but those are the ones clearly recorded in publicly accessible documents. The National Archives in Washington contains the trunk of Marlowe family ledgers, filed under Confiscated Property Records, Georgia, 1861-1865. A researcher accessing it today would find detailed accounting going back to 1780, documenting 79 children born and sold over 68 years, 79 documented in the ledgers. How many others went entirely unrecorded? Dr. Fielding's research was published in the Journal of Medical Ethics and History in 1868, Volume 12, Issue 3, pages 47-89. It can still be found in a few university libraries, occasionally cited in academic studies of slavery's medical dimensions. Sarah Gaines's book, The Invisible Ones, an account of systematic injustice in Georgia, published in 1872 by Small Press in Boston, exists in perhaps a dozen libraries nationwide. It's been out of print for more than a century. A few scholars have tried to get it republished, arguing its historical value, but publishers consistently decline, claiming insufficient public interest. And scattered across census records, birth certificates, death certificates, and family Bibles throughout the American South are traces of those children. People born at Thornhill or similar plantations, sold in infancy, who lived and died without ever knowing their full stories, without ever learning who their fathers were, without ever understanding the systematic exploitation that produced them. Some of their descendants are still alive today, carrying genes and family stories that hint at origins they can't fully trace. Occasionally someone doing genealogical research hits a wall, a trail that goes back to a child born enslaved in the 1830s or 1840s with no father listed, no clear family connections, sold as an infant from a Georgia plantation. The trail ends there, the mystery unsolvable without documentation that doesn't exist. Those invisible children remain invisible, even generations later. Their stories lost, their origins obscured, their suffering unacknowledged, except in the fragmentary records compiled by people like Dr. Fielding and Sarah Gaines, who tried to document a horror that their society had no interest in confronting. In 1892, more than 25 years after the end of slavery, a young reporter for the Atlanta Constitution named James Crawford decided to write a series on life after slavery, Voices of the Freedmen Generation. He traveled through rural Georgia, interviewing elderly people who'd been enslaved, collecting their stories for publication. In Chatham County, he interviewed a woman identified only as Mary S., aged approximately 75. She'd been enslaved on various plantations throughout her life, including a brief period at Thornhill in the 1840s. When Crawford asked about her experiences, she spoke at length about field work, about families being separated, about the daily hardships of slavery. Then she mentioned, almost as an aside, there was a cottage at Thornhill behind the main house. Women were kept there. Bad things happened in that cottage. Everyone knew. Nobody with power cared. Crawford asked her to elaborate. What kind of bad things? Mary stared at him silently for a long moment, then said, Things I won't describe in detail because you're young and because I'm tired of remembering. But women were imprisoned there. Children were born there. Children who looked white, all sold as babies. And when some of those women died in a fire, everyone said it was an accident. But we knew better. Was it true? Crawford asked. What you're describing, did it really happen that way? Mary was quiet for a long time. Everything I told you was true, she finally said. Everything we said happened. The women, the children, the cottage, the fire, all of it happened. But nobody with the power to stop it wanted to believe us. And now everybody wants to forget. Why would they want to forget? Because remembering means acknowledging what they allowed, what they participated in, what they profited from. It's easier to say slavery was bad in a vague way than to look at specific horrors and admit that people you respected, people you did business with, were doing this. Easier to forget than to face what that says about your society. Crawford published the interview in his series. It was read by a few thousand people in Georgia, then forgotten as the newspaper was recycled, as other stories dominated attention, as the nation continued moving on from uncomfortable history. But somewhere in the archives, Mary's testimony exists, along with Dr. Fielding's research, Sarah Gaines's book, the courthouse records, the federal ledgers, the cemetery documentation, Rebecca Hartwell's auction house records, and all the other fragmentary evidence compiled over decades by people who believed that truth mattered even when justice seemed impossible. The documentation is there. The evidence exists. The system that enabled it, protected it, and made it profitable is a matter of historical record. What happened at Thornhill Plantation happened. The cottage existed. The women were imprisoned there. The children were born and sold. The fire killed 4 women who may have chosen death over continued captivity. All of it happened, documented in records that survive to this day. And what happened at Thornhill Plantation wasn't unique. It was replicated at estates across the South, enabled by legal principles that treated enslaved women's bodies as property, protected by a system designed to ensure that powerful men faced no accountability for their actions. The scale of it, hundreds of plantations, thousands of children over centuries, is almost incomprehensible. But the documentation exists, scattered across archives and libraries, preserved by people who believed that bearing witness mattered, even when no one with power seemed to be listening. The records remain. The truth is there, for anyone willing to look. The only question that remains is whether anyone cares enough to remember, to acknowledge, to ensure that this particular horror isn't forgotten in the broader narrative of slavery's evils. Georgia kept discovering slave children with European features. All came from the same estate. The documentation proves it. The testimony confirms it. The pattern is undeniable. And Edmund Marlowe died wealthy, respected, facing no consequences. That's the truth that the records preserve. That's the story that the documentation tells. Whether it matters is a question that each generation must answer for itself.